Ce qu'on entend sur la Montagne, that which you hear on the mountain. Now, the reason that I've chosen to talk about this tone poem is that I've been influenced by this book, 19th Century Music by Carl Dalhouse. I'm trying to make sure I don't get reflections there. Now, I've talked to some of you about this book. It's a fairly standard textbook now. A lot of music colleges will use it, a lot of universities use it. It's the sort of standard introduction to the 19th century. So if you decide to buy it, it will not be money wasted. It's very thorough in its exploration of all sorts of 19th century music. And interestingly, Dalhouse's idea is that the 19th century actually extends into the early 1900s, up until really the break with tonality that Schoenberg brought about. So I really do recommend the book. One of the things I've been doing over the lockdown is reading that. Sometimes you get a bit frustrated with the long words because although the translation is good, it's translating from academic German, and there's a sort of tradition of long words, but it's worth persevering with because it is very well done. Very great bit of scholarship. Anyway, Dalhouse talks about this particular tone poem, and in fact, if you've got the book, if you turn to page 239, he talks about how Liszt came up with the idea of the tone poem, and then he does a couple of pages of sort of describing the piece. Well worth looking at. Ce qu'on entend sur la Montagne is the first of the Liszt tone poems. Some of you have already heard me talk about Les Préludes. This comes before that. Interesting that both of them are based on French poems. And actually, it's that French connection which I'd like to look at first. Let's just remind ourselves, when does Liszt start to write these tone poems? It all comes from a move that he made in 1848. He was 35, which is actually quite young, but he'd had this career as a virtuoso pianist touring around Europe, and he decided that he was going to move to Weimar and concentrate on composition. And as I say, this piece is the first one that he composed. But he'd had the sketches for this piece. He'd been carrying them around pretty well for 15 years, so from when he was a very young man. And he'd been thinking about how he was going to use these ideas. He was trying to solve the problem of marrying up his improvisational keyboard style with more rigorous styles of music, the styles of music that were symbolised by his home in Germany. In other words, this sort of French virtuosity and impulsive music making with a more considered and thought through logical German style. And this is what Dalhouse says, that Liszt's solution to trying to marry up these two things gave birth to a musical genre which apparently, unlike earlier genres, can be understood entirely in aesthetic and compositional terms, without regard for conditions of social history and the history of institutions. So in other words, it stands in its own terms. This type of music came around because Liszt wanted it to come around. It's not there because it was written for church, or it was written for a dance, or for some palace function. And those are the institutions that he might be talking about. It's not written for an academy. It's written for Liszt. This is a problem that Liszt saw, and it's his solution to it. And in Weimar, he had the opportunity basically to do what he wanted, and he had an orchestra at his disposal that he could experiment on, or experiment with. But let's just go back to the 1830s. And this is when Liszt, as I say, was a virtuoso pianist. He spent a lot of time in Paris, and he came across the music of Berlioz. And we can see how important the music of Berlioz was to this by the fact that he did these transcriptions. I'm sure you all know the Symphonie Fantastique. Well, transcribing that for solo piano is a feat in itself. But as well as that, he also transcribed the Overture des Francs Juges, the Overture du Roi Lear, or King Lear, and he did Harold in Italy. So that's a fair bit of music. I'm trying to mentally add up the amount of minutes that is, but it's probably 3 hours worth of music there, give or take. So he knew Berlioz's music intimately. And of course, Berlioz was interested in program music. And in fact, in 1837, Berlioz wrote an article for the Gazette de Paris, and it was called L'imitation en musique, or Imitation in Music. And what he does in this article is he talks about the division of program music into two categories. I've got to say, this is one of these things that is very obvious when somebody says it to you, but I don't know if you've necessarily thought of this. What Berlioz does is he divides program music into two types, direct and indirect. Or I say program music, he's talking about imitation, direct imitation or indirect imitation. And direct is imitating real things. So if you want a bird call, you write something that sounds like a bird. And that happens in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony at the end of the second movement. If you know Wagner's opera Siegfried, there's quite an important passage in that where the woodwind imitate bird calls in a forest. And we can probably all think of pieces where the orchestra imitate cannon. We might be able to think of pieces where the orchestra is imitating rolls of thunder and storms. And that's direct imitation. The orchestra or the piano or whatever it is sounds like the thing that it is trying to describe. And he also puts into that category, and I think this is quite, it shows that, well, you know, this is a very deep mind, that culturally meaningful things are also direct imitation. So, and actually Liszt is very prone to doing this. He'll stick in deliberately religious sounding music. So you stick a hymn tune in, you stick a plain chant in. That association is immediate and not really something that you can misinterpret. If you know what a hymn tune is, you're going to recognise it. And similarly, things like funeral marches. Again, if you know what a funeral march is, when you hear a funeral march, you know it's a funeral march. There's no ambiguity there. The thing is what it is. But Berlioz says that he's more interested in, and actually Liszt says that he is more interested in, this second lot, indirect or emotional imitation. And this is the idea of music acting as a metaphor. The idea of using music to associate particular emotional states with what you're listening to, and using music to express psychological states. Now, these things, trying to deal with metaphor, but let's think about this word metaphor. It is a poetic word. Poetry deals in metaphor. And so you can see why Liszt was thinking of music in poetical terms. If this is what he was trying to do, it's a poem. And that is the essence of why he calls it a tone poem or a symphonic poem. Okay. Now then, Berlioz goes on in this article to make a big differentiation between representation and expression. That's representation is direct imitation, expression is indirect. And as I've just been saying, they're really concerned, both Berlioz and Liszt are most concerned with expressing states of consciousness and psychological states. If you know the Symphonie Fantastique, that's a very good example of Berlioz's preoccupation with this idea of what does the artist, remember the Symphonie Fantastique is all about this young artist and who's in love, and it's all about how he feels indolent sometimes, passionate other times, angry sometimes, desperate other times. He sees the beloved and his heart explodes. All this stuff is how does that person feel? And it's an attempt to try and convey emotion. And of course, there is a difficulty with that because the direct imitation, the bird song, the cannon fire, the thing is what it is. Emotional music, it's very hard to say that if I play a particular phrase and I say this is love music, you will agree with me that this is love music unless I tell you that I think that this is love music. Sometimes the thing that you're trying to explain needs explanation before you hear what it is. We'll come on to that later. But to sum up, what Berlioz is saying is this individual subjective vision is at the heart of 19th century programme music. So this is the sort of thinking that Liszt got from Berlioz, and as I say, he knew his music very well. And we can see some sort of reflection of that Berlioz way of thinking in this preface to Album d'un Voyageur, Année de Pèlerinage, Book 1, 1842. So that's 5 years after the Berlioz article. And excuse me, I'll just read this to you. This is what Liszt says. Having in recent times visited many new lands, many different places, and many situations consecrated by history and poetry. And I do like that. Consecrated has got that sort of idea of religiosity, that it's holy. This is a very 19th century idea that art is holy and that nature is holy. But the things that are consecrated are human things, human history and poetry. So consecrated by history and poetry, having felt that these varied aspects of nature and the things that take place in nature are not simply empty images that pass before my eyes, but are deep emotions that move the soul, emotions that link me in an indefinable yet immediate way to the things that I have seen, having with them an inexplicable yet unmistakable rapport. I have tried to express in music some of the stronger emotions that are the fruit of my more vivid experiences. If there'd been Snapchat and Instagram when Liszt was around, possibly we wouldn't have all this music. But there weren't those things, and so he had to write pieces of music. Whether that's a good thing or not is a subjective opinion. Anyway, there we are. That's that very romantic language talking about what he's trying to do in music is to portray the feelings and the emotions that have come up in his soul through the experience that he has had. Now, Berlioz, if you go back to the article, appears to attack this attitude. And this is what I was just referring to a couple of minutes ago. Because Berlioz says that the expression of feelings aroused by an object cannot be universal. So the way that we react to things is not the same. Again, it's a fairly obvious thing to say, but our emotions are personal, they are individual, and they are subjective. So that is, he says, music does not act like a spoken language. So for an audience, direct communication in programme music can only go one way, from the programme to the music, and not from the music to the programme. In other words, if I'm writing a piece and I want to tell you something about a feeling, to be certain that you are thinking about the same feeling as I want you to, I need to write down that this is about disgust. This is about sorrow. Because I cannot be certain that my music will definitely spark off that emotion unless you have that knowledge. So programme music needs to tell you what it's about. In other words, you need to be told what the programme is. And actually, in another bit of writing, now this is actually after Liszt has started writing these tone poems, but he's talking here about Berlioz's Harold Symphony. He shows that he understood what Berlioz is talking about, and this is how he describes the programme. It's any preface in intelligible language added to a piece of purely instrumental music by means of which the composer intends to guard the listener against a wrong poetical interpretation and to direct his attention to the poetical idea of the whole. It's funny, I think that's a brilliant definition, but it's a pity that he starts with something that's negative. If he'd said, a preface in intelligible language added to a piece of purely instrumental music by means of which the composer intends to tell the listener what it's about, that would be really positive. But no, it's to guard the listener against a wrong poetical interpretation. Well, there you are. But that is a really good definition of what a program is. It's just telling you, it's something in language that tells you what the piece is about. Now then, when Dalhouse is talking about what Liszt is trying to do with the symphonic poem, he says there are three interrelated problems. And the first of these is that Liszt was trying to use the classical ideal or the classical model of the symphony. And let's just think about what we mean by that. We mean a multi-movement piece, usually 4 movements. The first movement of which would be using sonata principle, or sometimes called first movement principle. There will be a change of tempo for the second movement, it's normally slower. There'll be a change of tempo for the third movement, which will be a minuet or a scherzo, and there will be a finale, and a finale can be in any number of forms. The movements will have changes of key, changes of mood, changes of expression, and that is what we expect from a symphony. But what Liszt is trying to do is he's got the ideal of the symphony, but he doesn't want a derivative dependence on its traditional formal scheme. In other words, he doesn't want to just write something that fits in the boxes. This is the first movement box, the second movement box, and so on, because he feels that that's been done. There's no point doing something that other people have done brilliantly. Of course, particularly Beethoven's done it brilliantly. Dalhouse, by the by, is very interesting about the history of the symphony because the symphony is an odd thing. There's a period where it's very important, and then in the middle of the 19th century, nobody actually writes symphonies, and Wagner says that the symphony is dead. And between about 1850 and 1870, Wagner is largely right. And then inexplicably, in about 1870, people start writing symphonies again. And there's no particular reason why this should happen, but they do. So the symphony has got a very odd history. Anyway, at the stage that Liszt is talking about, much at the same time as Wagner says, the symphony is dead. So he wants to use symphonic ideas, but he doesn't want to just wear the old clothes, as it were, the old clothes of the classical symphony. He wanted to elevate, to lift up program music from a base, picturesque genre to poetic and philosophical sublimity. That's a very Liszt thing, that it has to be sublime. And I've talked about this with some of you already, but he's a very funny guy because there's this religious side to Liszt. Later in life he went around wearing clerical clothes, and he called himself the abbé, which is really quite a junior clerical position, but still that's what he called himself. But he was also famous as a lover, and a lover of the good things in life as well as women. But he was there's these two sides to his nature. And very often in his pieces, he deals with these two things. The Faust symphony, all the Faust ideas are very important to him because this is something about the immortal soul and the devil. And that's Liszt in a nutshell. And in fact, these two ideas of the sublime and the human and the human being base is part of what this tone poem that we're looking at, the Berg Symphony, or Qu'on Entend sur la Montagne. The more I say it, the better I think I get at it. That's what this piece is about as well. And Liszt was obsessed with the idea that it must be possible to unite the French romantic gestures of his earlier piano compositions with a tradition of thematic and motivic manipulation. In a way, we're starting to repeat ourselves here, but he's basically saying, can I get this poetic thing and put it in the context of the logical symphony, this marriage between the head and the heart? Now then, before the tone poem, there were instrumental pieces that were a bit like tone poems. This is quite interesting, and it's the concert overture. As a genre, the symphonic poem derives from the concert overture, but it aims higher to the legacy of the symphony. But it also aims to rescue the symphony from its formalistic straitjacket by using program ideas derived from the overture. Now, there's two types of overtures, of course. There's what's known as a potpourri overture. Now, that is the sort of overture you get before an operetta, where basically the composer just stitches together some of the best tunes from the opera that's coming or the operetta that's coming, and that is the overture. So it's a bit like a catalogue for a shop. It just shows you what's going to be on offer, but it wants to tempt you in. But there are other overtures which have got themes that are about something. So the Berlioz Carnaval Roman is a good example of that. And the Carnaval Roman goes through different emotions and therefore different tempos. And you can see how that would interest Liszt, because if this overture can start with a sort of maybe with a fanfare and then have a romantic melody and then get all excited and have a tarantella or something like that, that's the sort of thing that he wants to do with the tone poem. So how did Liszt manage to make these disparate things into a successful new genre? Let us find out. So he used the principle of sonata form but modified the architecture and its thematic logic almost beyond recognition. So what is the principle of sonata form? Well, I think, and I will say this very quickly because I've probably bored you all a lot about this so far. There's the main idea is that you have contrast. You have something in one key and you have something else in another key. This is a tonic and this is a new tonic, and it's the working out of those things that makes the drama of sonata form. At heart, there's a tonal contrast and there is a contrast of character of themes. Now, what Liszt does is that sometimes you can say, well, this bit is like a first subject, and then he has something else in a different tempo and in a different key, and you could say, well, this is possibly the second subject. Or you could say that first bit was sort of the first movement and this second bit is sort of the second movement. And this is where talking about the tone poems can become very difficult. I just go down to the third point here. Identifying a sonata principle within a tone poem is difficult. Is it a four-movement sonata played without breaks? So is it a first movement, a slow movement, a scherzo movement and a finale? Or is it an extended sonata form which introduces contrasts of mood and tempo beyond what you'd expect in a normal first movement? And if you get into reading analyses about the tone poems, you'll see that people very often try and describe it in sonata terms, but have difficulty because it's not very clear. And one of the other thing that Liszt introduces, so I'm sorry to be doing these in the wrong order, but in the second thing I've got here, this idea of motivic transformation or metamorphosis. So he's concerned to try and make everything hang together. So he has themes that go through the whole piece, and they change as the piece moves on, so that they are creating new ideas, but they're still recognisably the first idea. And now, Liszt is not the first person to do this. Obviously, Berlioz did it in Symphonie Fantastique because he has an idée fixe, and that's his way of talking about a fixed idea, a motif. And the idée fixe goes through transformations as the piece goes on. It's exactly what Liszt is doing here, and it's exactly what Wagner does later in his operas when he has what are called leitmotifs, things that are associated with characters or moods, and as the opera goes on, they get transformed as the character or the mood transforms. So that's what he's trying to do, and that's pretty well where I want to get to today. So before we get into looking at the score, which is what I'll do next time I talk to you, maybe the thing to do now is to just have another listen to the piece and start to think about it in terms of sonata form and symphonic form. And can you see where there is a slow movement? Can you see where there's a scherzo? I do think that the slow movement is quite spottable. And then can you see any sort of shape to the piece that links it to sonata form or sonata principle or symphonic form? So thank you very much for listening to this one. I hope you're still awake. If it's really boring, you can try watching it at 1.5 times speed or even 2 times speed.
But I might start talking quicker if I find out that's what you're all doing.
Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye for now.